camera rolling? All right, Tim. Action.
Hello, my name is Tim Malone, and I'm a retired American history teacher. And we've been talking about Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the United States, and American entry into World War I, and the legacy of Wilson, which the last video we talked about Wilsonianism, the term Wilsonianism, the ideology of, the doctrine of, the beliefs of Woodrow Wilson, as have been down through the years the dominant foreign policy position of the United States since 1945, since the end of World War II. All American presidents have been Wilsonians, except for Donald Trump. And right now, today, this is March 13th, 2025, the Ukraine situation, where Trump is trying to disassociate the United States from our European allies, talks about getting out of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a Wilsonian institution, multilateralism, a legacy of Wilsonianism. What I want to do today is I want to talk about an article, What W Owes to WW, from the Atlantic Monthly in March of 2005. Now that's a long time ago. That's 20 years ago, this article. I used this article in my classes, handed it out, gave a quiz on it, discussed it for 15 years. And I still like this article a lot because it talks about Wilsonianism. And I love the picture, Woodrow Wilson with George Bush with his hand on his shoulder. This is by David M. Kennedy, a heavyweight historian, Kennedy. In 2005, he taught at Stanford. I don't even know, that's 20 years ago. I don't even know if Kennedy's still alive. I should check that out, but it says here, David M. Kennedy teaches history at Stanford University. He won the 2000 Pulitzer Prize for History. That's pretty good. And I love this piece because it talks about Wilsonianism and the legacy of it. And of course, in 2005, Kennedy's talking about American involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, in 2005, we'd been in Iraq for 2 years, and Afghanistan for 2 years, and Iraq for 1 year. We ended up over 20 years in each of them, with forces in those two countries after 9/11. The response of George W. Bush to the attacks on 9/11 was to invade Afghanistan and then invade Iraq and initiate these quagmires, these 20-year wars. And according to Kennedy, based on the legacy of Wilsonianism. If you remember, we went into Iraq to find weapons of mass destruction, to take Saddam Hussein's, as it turned out, non-existent weapons of mass destruction. And the minute it became clear, a couple of months after our invasion of Iraq, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, if you remember, Bush and his administration turned immediately to justifying the war, the invasion and the war, based upon, we're going to bring democracy to Iraq. We're going to bring democracy to Afghanistan. It was like a knee-jerk fallback. That's Wilsonianism. One of the tenets of Wilsonianism, the United States should promote at the barrel of a gun if necessary, with a military invasion if necessary. We should bring the gift of democracy, no matter how tenuously defined democracy. We should bring the gift of democracy to the world. Now, we're pretty much out. I mean, Afghanistan kicked us out a couple of years ago. I think we still have some American military personnel in Iraq, in the north with the Kurds. But pretty much both those Wilsonian crusades failed miserably, as did the Wilsonian crusade in Vietnam in the 1960s when we were going to bring the gift of democracy to South Vietnam. Failed miserably. Now, all our interventions, our Wilsonian interventions, haven't failed. You can say, well, South Korea, there's a success of Wilsonian intervention. I guess. But this article by Kennedy, let me present some of it here. What W owes to WW. And here's the subhead. President Bush may not even know it, but he can trace his view of the world to Woodrow Wilson, who defined a diplomatic destiny for America that we can't escape. A diplomatic destiny that the United States can't escape. That's according to Kennedy. Wilsonianism, we can't escape it. Now let me again give my opinion that it seems like Donald Trump today is trying to escape Wilsonianism. We'll see what happens. Kennedy calls Wilsonianism the only consistent tradition in American foreign policy. And he kind of sets up three different alternatives in foreign policy, American history. Isolationism is one. That's the original. Preached by Washington and Jefferson, even Hamilton. The United States should stay out of European affairs, should stay out of the great power conflicts between France and England and Austria and Russia and Prussia, Spain. We've got our independence. We have a whole continent to develop and exploit, and therefore we're going to stay out of European power politics. That was the first 100 years, the first 120 years of the nation's existence. Now also, our revolution, the American Revolution, was an anti-imperial revolution. We left an empire. And during the first 100 years, we were supposedly opposed to European colonialism, the United States. When we revolted and left the British Empire, we set an example that many other colonies attempted to emulate. We want our freedom. We don't want to be a colony of England or France. Look at the Americans. They left. Let's be like them. Let's get rid of these imperialistic dominators. With the Spanish-American War, with American development, with the Spanish-American War, which we talked about, the United States joined in imperialism. We had become a great power after the Civil War with our industrial development. We talked about that too in a lecture. The dramatic industrial development of the United States. And we became a great power. And with the Spanish-American War, McKinley and then Teddy Roosevelt said, we got to get in the colony game, which was a betrayal to a certain extent of our own revolution. We used to be anti-imperial. Well, let me say this. From the point of view of Native Americans, the United States was always a deadly, ferocious, take no pity imperial power. So, I mean, American imperialism has been with us from the beginning. But again, we're talking about European power politics and European imperialism in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, when France and England and Belgium, for Christ's sakes, were dividing up Africa and Southeast Asia, around the world. Roosevelt was a diplomatic realist. Power is all that matters in foreign affairs. Power. The more powerful ones pick on the weaker ones. Diplomatic realism. Kennedy talks about that. So we had isolationism, then diplomatic realism, Spanish-American War, and then Wilsonianism. And I've kind of posited those three as a dialectical setup, and we'll put up the Wilsonian dialectic, as I call it. Isolationism was the thesis. According to dialectical thinking, you have a dominant thesis, and then it sort of automatically creates its antithesis. So we had anti-imperial, isolationism, and then that creates Rooseveltian Spanish-American War, invasions of Haiti and Dominican Republic are, and Wilson gets in on this too, in his early part of his administration, sending troops into every country in the Caribbean, damn near. Diplomatic realism, and then the conflict, the synthesis is Wilsonianism, which is, as I think I said, you can think of it as moralistic, idealistic. We're going to spread the true religion of political democracy and free markets and idealism, kind of a utopian aspect to it. Wilsonianism is the synthesis. Wilsonianism, Kennedy says, is an authentically American foreign policy. And we talked about the fact that Wilsonianism, when Wilson goes to Paris, Versailles, to negotiate the end of World War I, he brings back the Versailles Treaty, and from immense popularity. I mean, did anybody ever have a more dramatic rise and a more dramatic fall than Woodrow Wilson? When he's in Paris negotiating that treaty, he sells out most of his 14 points to Britain and France. And he gets his League of Nations, but in the process, the negotiating process, his popularity, which was never great, that's another thing, I've emphasized this before. World War I was never popular with the American people. History books and historians tend to miss this point, in my opinion. Again, World War I and World War II are so closely linked in Americans' mind historically that World War II was popular. Well, the Japanese attacked us and Hitler had to go. And we look back through World War I through World War II. World War II was popular, so World War I must have been popular. No, it wasn't. It wasn't popular. And the Wilsonian moment, as some historians call it, when 2 million people turn out in Paris to, he's the savior, yay, 14 points. Wilsonian idealism, yay. It's a dramatic fall, especially here in the United States. So Wilsonianism fails, and you get World War II. The League of Nations, Wilson's baby, fails. You get World War II. But after World War II, the leadership in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Harry Truman, are Wilsonians, self-confessed Wilsonians. And they were going to do things differently after World War II. And the United Nations, the offspring of the League of Nations, is not only the United States joins, but we put the headquarters in New York City. And again, today, 80 years, we've had a Wilsonian foreign policy, NATO, trade agreements, common market, European Union. We backed all those things. And again, sort of the bottom line is there's still American troops in Europe today, 80 years. Now that's what, the story is. If we'd only listened to Wilson and left American troops in Europe after World War I, no Hitler, no World War II. Now I don't know about that, but that's the story. Yeah, this piece by Kennedy is a good synopsis of Wilsonianism and how American presidents, and again, it's very pertinent now because, again, in my opinion, you could frame the Trump foreign policy as a repudiation of Wilsonianism. Wilsonianism was about taking walls down, economic walls, political walls, freedom of the seas, free trade, Wilsonianism. And Trump, America first. Walls, literally walls, economic walls, tariffs, diplomatic walls. Put the walls up. Wilsonianism, and this is simplistic, it's a bit simplistic, but it's useful to think about Wilsonianism as tear walls down, one world. Now I want to talk about textbooks and Wilson. Now, yesterday I was talking to a couple of my historian friends, and I told them that Wilsonianism isn't in the dictionary. And they scoffed at me. And then one of them got out his computer and ultimately, Malone, you're right. It's not. At least not in some of the major dictionaries. Wilsonianism, this all-important concept, this all-important word in American history, is not in Webster's dictionary, is not in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's kind of unbelievable. So I got some notes here from 5 textbooks. One is Alan Brinkley's American History, the largest selling American history textbook, at least 10 years ago. And again, we're going to mix up Wilson's domestic policy and his foreign policy. Brinkley says that Wilson was known as a brilliant progressive. Now, historians are supposed to be objective, and I don't know. Wilson was smart. There's no doubt about that. He was a college professor. He wrote books about American government before he became president. But I don't know if a historian should call him brilliant, especially when you consider that his administration ended up pretty much an abject failure. Brinkley says, Woodrow Wilson was a genuinely progressive candidate. Again, identifying Wilson as a progressive. In my progressive lectures, we talked about the 3 progressive presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. I'm going to present a viewpoint here in a minute that Wilson was never a progressive. He was a fake progressive. He talked progressive talk for political reasons. Now that's contentious, but at least it should be presented, I think, in a textbook. He says Wilson was a bold and forceful president. That's true. Apparently, he was a great orator. Woodrow Wilson could give a speech. But, he became president in 1913 till 1921. And that's just at the beginning of electrified recordings of speeches. And I've been remiss because, I might say, are there any recordings of Wilson speaking, giving a speech? And I don't know that. I should find that out because he was supposed to be a spellbinder, that he could sway audiences with his oratory. For one thing, Wilson refused to support the movement for women's suffrage until during the war. There's a major subsection in Brinkley called the Search for a New World Order. Now that's an interesting concept, the New World Order, because that was what Bush 1, Herbert Walker Bush, W's father, who was president for 4 years, and he invaded Kuwait to take it back from Saddam Hussein, the coalition of the willing, which is a Wilsonian idea, right? You got to have allies. It's all important when you go around invading places that you have a coalition. Coalitions, that's very Wilsonian. And that Bush talked about when we took Kuwait back from Saddam, that a new world order. And it's interesting that a number of these historians I'm going to talk about use that terminology. Now, I don't know if Wilson used the terminology, a new world order, but that's definitely what he had in mind. It definitely was what he wanted, a new world order. Wilson wanted a democratic post-war settlement, a again linking the word democracy with Wilson. Now, Wilsonianism is, everybody, and myself included, talks about Wilsonianism as pro-democracy. But what does that mean? Democracy is a very slippery term. And it's a democracy if you call it one. Because, I don't know, we spread democracy where? South Korea is a Wilsonian success, but South Korea has lapsed into dictatorship every so often over its span, it's 1950 to the present. There's a number of fake democracies that the United States has set up and supported and perpetuated. Democracy in name only, but in the textbooks, Wilson and democracy, Wilsonianism and democracy are like synonyms, and it's not that simple. It's just not that simple. There was a subsection in Brinkley where he labels it Woodrow Wilson's idealistic vision of a new world order. Now that's pro-Wilson, isn't it? When you call him an idealistic vision, he had an idealistic vision. And I think that as we go through this, and as I present these textbook visions of Wilson and Wilsonianism, it's all very positive. Now, I'm going to present a contrary view about Wilson here in a minute, but Wilson gets really good historical press, in my opinion, undeservedly to a certain extent, which again we'll come back and cover. But Brinkley is definitely pro-Wilson. He has a section called the Wilsonian Moment, when Wilson went to Europe and drawn 2 million supporters in Paris when he gets there. Now that all goes south rather quickly, but there's a Wilsonian moment. Then he's got another subsection called Woodrow Wilson's Ordeal. Because Wilson brings the treaty back, the Senate doesn't look like they're going to pass it. So he goes out on a speaking tour from the back of a train, and in the midst of that speaking tour, he has a stroke. Wilson has a stroke. And to this day, we don't know how serious it was. The last 2 years, almost 2 years of his administration, he's bedridden. His wife and his chief of staff, that's what in effect he was, House, keep his condition secret. Now that's one of the things that I dislike about Woodrow Wilson. Should the President of the United States keep his health status secret from the American people? How about no? No, that's a crime against democracy. To this day, we still don't know how infirm Wilson was. Some people say his wife and Colonel House, his aide, were in effect president, that he was a vegetable. Others, like senators and congressmen, would visit him and say, oh, he could talk, he's cogent, but they might want to say that about him. At any rate, Brinkley has a section called The Retreat from Idealism. Again, the idealistic, moral, democracy. These are the terms that are traditionally associated with Wilson. And I have a much more darker view of him. I think he was a chameleon. I think he was a politician. And he said what he thought he needed to say to succeed as a politician. Woodrow Wilson's bold and idealistic dream of peace based on the principles of democracy and justice suffered a painful death. Look at what Brinkley. Woodrow Wilson's bold and idealistic dream of peace based on the principles of democracy and justice suffered a painful death. In the aftermath of World War I, the American people seemed to turn away from Wilson's ideals and entered a very different era, a reassertion of isolationism. In fact, between World War I and World War II, a lot of historians use capital I isolationism, that we became more isolationist than ever in the aftermath of Wilson's miscarry of Wilsonian idealism. And we didn't even want to, Hitler comes to power, Hitler conquers most of Europe, has England on the ropes, and the United States still didn't want to get into that war. It took the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor and then Hitler declaring war on us a couple of days later to get us into World War II, when this obnoxious, genocidal Nazi regime was on the brink of conquering all of Europe. The American people still didn't want to get into it against Hitler because of their distaste for Wilsonianism. And then once the United States gets in and defeats Germany and Japan and brings a new world order, then Wilsonianism is reborn and dominates American foreign policy to this day. Here's another one from a textbook by Rourke, The American Promise, A History of the United States, 2015. Rourke calls World War I a progressive crusade. Now, I'm going to talk about a book here in a minute where it's posited that World War I crushed progressivism. Progressivism didn't survive World War I. And here Rourke's presenting that World War I was part of progressivism. And here, here's the another trope about Wilson. Rourke says, Wilson resisted demands for war. Wilson didn't want to get us into that war. Bzzz. No, in my opinion, I'm with Walter Karp, I'm going to talk about here in a minute. Wilson wanted to get into that war on England's side from the very beginning. Wilson wanted us in that war from the very beginning because he's an Anglophile. He loved England. He wrote a book before he became president saying our system should be more like the parliamentary system in England. He loved England. He wanted us in that war. Wilson's statements, oh, we shouldn't get in this war, we're going to be neutral, were political because he understood that the American people didn't want to get into that war, never wanted to get into that war. Again, let me repeat, World War I was very unpopular with the American people from beginning to end. Wilson didn't resist demands for war. Wilson declared or decided to reaffirm his noble war ideals. This is Rourke. By announcing the 14 points, Wilson's noble war ideals. That's objective history. Wilson is treated so well in our textbooks. And then Rourke also talks about Wilson's dreams for a new world order. He uses that phrase too, new world order. I mean, it's true, but I just wonder if Bush 1 hadn't used that term back in the 90s, if it would be in history books in the 2000s. New world order. Conclusion, Rourke, a troubled crusade, Wilsonianism, a troubled crusade. In the end, rather than promoting democracy, the war bred fear, intolerance, and repression. The Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, passed with Wilson's approval during the war to stifle dissent. I mean, I could give an entire lecture on the repression of dissent during World War I. The German community in the United States. My grandmother, my dad's mother, was German American. Her father, my great-grandfather, Miller, had come to the United States from Germany in the 1880s. My dad would smatter German, And the German language, there were millions of German speakers. There were German grade schools and German high schools. And German was spoken by millions of Americans before World War I. And then Wilson, these repressive acts, the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act in 1918 made it illegal to criticize the president, a criminal offense, and people were arrested. People were harassed and beat up for speaking German. German language virtually disappeared during World War I. And it affected my family. My dad sometimes would use German words, but rare. Because I think German was spoken in his mother's household in Hampshire, Illinois. Yeah, that's another reason. We're stacking up the reasons not to like Woodrow Wilson, all right? Despite the fact that I'm in some ways a Wilsonian. It's ironic. He kept his health secret from the American people. He enthusiastically had Congress pass the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act in 1917 and 1918 during the war. And he promoted vigilante groups of prominent citizens to go around beating up people speaking German. He literally, all this flag nonsense was passed through the Sedition Act, just an aside here about socialism in the United States. Again, in 2012, the election of 2012, when Wilson was elected because the Republicans split, Eugene Debs ran as a socialist and got 1.5 million votes, about 10%. The Socialist Party was viable and active and popular. Milwaukee, right, was ruled by a socialist mayor. Of course, a lot of German Americans in Milwaukee. Debs gave a speech in which he said, he criticized the war. He was arrested and sent to federal penitentiary. And Wilson, after the war was over and Wilson's, zoned out in his bed, he would, a lot of people came to see him and say, oh, come on, pardon Debs. The war's over. He wouldn't do it. It took Harding, the next president, to let Debs out of prison. For what? For criticizing the war in America with the First Amendment. But the Socialist Party and the labor unions were viciously attacked during the war under the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. Viciously attacked. And there's been a school of history called the Consensus School, 1950s, 1960s. And one of their questions was, why doesn't the United States have a socialist party like they have in Germany and England and France? Why no socialism here? And Louis Hartz wrote a famous book, The Liberal Tradition in America, about that in the 1950s, giving all sorts of reasons why socialism didn't catch on in America. Well, there's no socialism in America because it was crushed during World War I by Wilson. That's why there's no socialist party. Wilson destroyed it. Don't give me this crap about American exceptionalism and, the Homestead Act and the freehold farmers. That's why we don't have socialism. No, we don't have a viable socialist party in this country because it was destroyed by Woodrow Wilson. Eric Foner, Give Me Liberty, An American History. Oh, look, he talks about the 14 points. The clearest statement of American war aims. Wilson's vision of a new international order. There it is again. They seem to love that phraseology. Democracy, again, Wilson and democracy, which he made criticism of the president a federal crime. And then the war is over, and Congress wants to repeal the Sedition Act that made criticism of the president a crime. And Wilson was against it. Wilson wanted criticism of the president to be a crime forever. Always. Now, Congress ended up repealing the Sedition Act against Wilson's lobbying. But come on, Woodrow. God. Now, I always used to make a joke in class when I taught Wilson, saying he was a college professor and a tyrant. And, Wilson, right or wrong, make criticism of the president a crime. That sounds like college professors I knew. I used to hang out with those guys. Never elect a college professor president again. And remember, what's the slogan during World War I? Make the world safe for democracy. The war effort and democracy, there's something wrong there because, again, we've backed undemocratic regimes under the banner of Wilsonianism for 80 years. Democracy. It was a key term during Wilson's war. Make the world safe for democracy. Now, I probably get in trouble for this, but in my opinion, in 1914, before the war in Europe, Germany, in some respects, was a more democratic nation than England. Let me repeat that. But yet, Wilson told the American people that Germany was a democracy. Now, the Prussian militarists had a lot of sway in Germany, but the militarists had a lot of sway in England too at the time. A war for democracy. Politically, I guess it worked. Despite the administration's idealistic language about democracy and freedom, the war inaugurated the most intense repression of civil liberties the nation has ever known. Making criticism of you couldn't criticize. Well, Debs got in trouble for giving a speech in which he said, "I'm opposed to the draft." Bang, federal prison. That was against the law. It was against the law to disrespect the flag, whatever the hell that meant. But we still have that. Sort of the burning the flag kind of thing is, 20 years ago or so, it was a hotter issue as protest, the burning American flag. The Supreme Court decided that, well, that's political expression. You can't make it illegal. But to this day, there's politicians out there saying, you burn the American flag. If you throw the American flag down and stomp on it, federal prison, son. That started, that sort of thing, disrespect for the flag, disrespect for the uniform. That all started with Wilson in World War I. And then, of course, there's the race problem, right? Wilson was a racist. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a while. Again, Foner talks about the Wilsonian moment. He has a subsection, the Wilsonian moment. The collapse of, then he's got a section called the collapse of the Wilsonian moment. The world is still haunted by the ghost of the Versailles Treaty, according to Foner. Still, yes. History has consequences. Then we got Murin, Liberty, Equality, Power, A History of the American People. And he describes Wilson as a struggling idealist. A struggling idealist. What? Again, this pro-Wilson bias in our history books. Government repression during the war fell most heavily on the labor unions and the Socialist Party. And then he says, Wilson did little to halt the repression. What an understatement. Wilson backed the repression. And again, Murin talks about the League of Nations would usher in Woodrow Wilson's New World Order. Again, that concept that Wilson was in favor of a New World Order. Murin says, the judgment of history lies heavily on these events, the rejection of the treaty by America. For many believe that the flawed treaty and the failure of the League contributed to the outbreak of World War II. And I have a comment here that says, no duh. World War I caused World War II. The peace settlement after World War I caused World War II. It was stupid. The Versailles Treaty was stupid. And there were people at the time, John Maynard Keynes, the great English economist, who said so at the time. It wasn't like anybody said, oh, what a great treaty. Oh, what went wrong? There were people at the time saying, this treaty is stupid. There's going to be a round two. World War I, this is Murin, at least he's got this right. World War I led to the collapse of the progressive movement. The failure of the peace process created the preconditions for another war. Then Farragut, Out of Many, A History of the American People. This is the textbook I used for 20 years. Wilson had a moral vision rooted in American exceptionalism. Well, yeah, I mean, Wilson thought we were God's gift to the world, the United States. That's one of the key elements of Wilsonianism, the indispensable nation. War inflamed racial hatreds in the United States. The worst race riots in the nation's history exploded in several cities during the last years of Wilson's term. Wilsonian idealism. Boy, he sure does get good press in the history books. I hope that helped. I've struggled with Wilson and World War I and Wilsonianism because it's so complicated and there's such a thicket of different interpretations. Now I'm going to talk about a book. The Politics of War by Walter Karp. This book has influenced me a great deal. The story of two wars, Spanish-American War and World War I, which altered forever the political life of the American Republic. The Politics of War. He talks about the progressive era, and he says, from 1890 to 1920, that's often been called the progressive era, an age of reform. Yet no substantial connection has been made by historians between domestic turmoil and the increasingly ambitious foreign policy of the age. Historians put them in different chapters, and that's true. Usually you have progressivism and then World War I. And what Karp says is you got to think of them as linked. American entry into World War I, as some of the historians I just talked about, crushed the progressive movement. Karp's book is the story of the defeat and final obliteration of progressivism in two foreign wars, the Spanish-American War and World War I. Now you skip chapter 7, talking about Wilson. Karp says, a man of high ideals but no principles. Until 1910, and he's elected president in 1912, Wilson preached states' rights, laissez-faire, and minimal government, as well as white supremacy, segregation, and the disenfranchisement of the poor. Wilson was to become the first American president to look upon the presidency as a stepping stone to personal greatness. I don't know about that. The decisive trait of Woodrow Wilson's political career was vainglory that would lead him to betray, in turn, progressivism, the fundamental liberties of the nation, and the hopes of a war-torn world. Between 2006 and 2008, there was not a single item on the progressive agenda that Woodrow Wilson did not militantly oppose. And yet, of course, he's included in the 3 progressive presidents. Karp's saying Wilson was no progressive, never was, and he took on a progressive tilt to get elected. Because by 2012 or 1912, everybody in both parties had to act like they were progressives. And that's what Wilson was doing. He was acting as a progressive. Now, I don't know about that. Karp, I think, exaggerated. Because Wilson, Federal Reserve, I think, was a progressive act. Child labor. There were some other things that Wilson championed and got passed in his first 2 years as president that were progressive. So that's a complicated situation, but I think Karp might be onto something. Around 1910, Democrats, and Wilson was a Democrat, take on the rhetoric of progressivism and promulgate a conservative progressivism. Starting during his campaign for the New Jersey governor in 1910, Wilson became a rhetorical progressive, according to Karp. He wasn't really a progressive. He took on the rhetoric of it in order to get elected. Woodrow Wilson had never been a reformer. This is according to Karp. It was in his Mexican policy before World War I that Woodrow Wilson revealed those singular qualities of character: a self-ennobling ambition, the contempt for the opinion of others, the bottomless self-deceit that would help him drag America into the trenches of France. Wilson, once convinced of the nobility of his own intentions, and that conviction always came easily to him, Woodrow Wilson would act without scruple and ignore common sense. Woodrow Wilson would cling tenaciously to noble aims he had just invented to suit his ambition. The central political fact about American entry into World War I was that the American people wanted above all else to stay out of it. From his prudent injunction that America remain neutral when the war broke out, Woodrow Wilson exempted himself. He was never impartial. From the start, Woodrow Wilson subscribed fully to the bromides of British propaganda. A few weeks after the war broke out in 1914, Wilson is quoted as saying, "Britain is fighting our fight." Self-deception, self-elation, and self-regard were the chief ingredients of Woodrow Wilson's celebrated idealism. Wilsonian idealism, according to Karp. Self-elation, self-deception, self-regard. Oh, man. Karp doesn't like Wilson. Now, the thing is that Wilson was very smart. He was a political scientist. He'd written books on government, so he was very good at manipulating Congress. He was the first president to go to Capitol Hill when Congress was in session and lobby House members and senators right there. In other words, there are times when they're debating something Wilson wants, and they are just standing outside the floor in the doorway. There's the President of the United States. Congress is debating a bill, and there's Wilson. Sort of like the Prime Minister of England. He was a champion of the parliamentary system. He was very persuasive. He was very cunning. But for what? Woodrow Wilson made American neutrality in World War I a false and biased neutrality. Now, of course, the war breaks out in Britain. The overwhelmingly naval power declared an embargo on Germany. They blockaded Germany, the British fleet. The United States is neutral. According to the laws, international law at the time, neutral ships could sail through a blockade of a belligerent power. Wilson, early on, the blockade's declared, and Wilson accedes to it. He says, we're going to honor British blockade. That's an act of war on Germany. And later on, after the war, the British say that if the United States would have said, hey, England, we're sending our ships through your blockade. Don't try to stop us. That they would have let us. They would have let neutral shipping through to Germany if the United States had insisted on its rights under international law. When Woodrow Wilson accedes to the British blockade and says, we're not going to send America, we're going to honor your blockade of Germany, that's an act of war on Germany. This is within a month of the declaration of war in 1914. Woodrow Wilson has taken Britain's side from the very beginning. Again, Woodrow Wilson maneuvered an unwilling nation into an unnecessary war and changed the world, changed world history. Because World War I is one of the true turning points in world history. World War I, perhaps still the most important event of the last 500 years? No. One of the most important events in all of history, World War I, and then, of course, its big brother, World War II. A.J.P. Taylor, the famous English historian, says they should be considered one war, with a 20-year truce in between. There's Carp. Woodrow Wilson once wrote that lying was permitted of great men. Indeed, the British later admitted that the British would have lifted the blockade of Germany entirely rather than risk American friendship. Never before in the history of neutrality had a neutral nation attempted to defend a belligerent shipping from attacks by its enemies. Because Wilson would go so far, because the Germans respond with submarine blockade of England. And Wilson promulgates that if an armed British merchant ship carrying war supplies to England had one American on board, the Germans had to surface, at great danger to a submarine, had to surface and get that American off the British ship before they could destroy it. Unbelievable. The U.S. had granted without demur the right of the British to blow up neutral ships in the North Sea. Of course, he ran for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, Wilson, he kept us out of war, all the while trying to get us into the war, all the while taking England's side. He kept us out of war, and he's re-elected in a very close election in 1916. And then he kept us out of war. He's re-elected in November of 1916 under the slogan, he kept us out of war, with the implication being, re-elect him and he'll continue to keep us out of war. Back then, presidents were inaugurated in March. Re-elected in November, takes the oath of office for a second term in March, and within 2 weeks, declares war on Germany. He kept us out of war for 2 weeks. That's the greatest crime that a politician can do, isn't it? Run as a peace candidate, all the while knowing that you're going to get the country into the war as soon as possible after you're reelected, declaring peace. It's hard for me to, this is where I really, really get anti-Wilson. You know, this is, I mean, what a crime. That's a crime. And he's not the only one. Lyndon Johnson, right? Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, he runs for re-election in 1964. Kennedy's assassinated in 63. Johnson's his vice president. He becomes president. He runs for re-election in 1964, saying about Vietnam, right? Vietnam was a problem. Our South Vietnam, that artificial creation in the 1950s. Communists were going to take it over. They ended up taking it over. And Johnson says during the campaign, I'm not sending American boys to fight in an Asian war. He runs as I'm not going to get America involved in Vietnam. He's reelected in November of 64. He's inaugurated in January. They changed the inauguration date. In January of 65, and on March, he sends troops to Vietnam. That son of a bitch. I mean, and Wilson falls into that same damn category. They run as peace candidates. They're reelected, and within months, within weeks, war. Is there any greater sin that a Democratic candidate, small d Democratic candidate, can commit than to run as a peace candidate, all the while lying, knowing they're going to get the country into a war at the first opportunity? And both of them cats did that. I get excited about that. You know, I mean, Wilson, that ought to trump everything else, you know, in his historical regard, in how he's presented to the American people in history, that he kept us out of war.